The strangest thing about being used as a weapon against yourself is that nobody tells you it's happening while it's happening. They just hand you a calendar invite, a name badge, and a woman named Claire. And they say, "Train her well." And you do. Because that is what you have spent 31 years doing. Things well. Even when well is the last thing anyone deserves from you. I want to tell you something before we get into it. I want to tell you that I am not a dramatic person. I am 53 years old. I have managed a level 2 biosafety lab in Boston for 11 years. I have calibrated centrifuges at 6 in the morning in the dark, alone, because the alternative was data drift. And data drift in a phase 2 oncology trial means someone's mother gets a treatment dosage extrapolated from a lie. I do not romanticize my work. I do not post inspirational quotes. I drink exactly 1 cup of coffee before noon, and I consider that a personality. So when I tell you that what happened to me at Vericept Biosciences over the course of 6 weeks in the fall of 2022 is the most quietly extraordinary thing I have ever witnessed from the inside, believe me, I did not want it to be. The impossible fact, the thing I want you to hold in your head from the beginning, is this. The woman they hired to replace me was never planning to replace me. She was planning to destroy them. And I, the person they were discarding, spent 6 weeks handing her everything she needed to do it. Every document, every protocol log, every Slack message I'd saved in a folder I'd labeled, with tremendous corporate optimism, CIA. I trained their prosecution. They paid me on the way out to do it, and I didn't know, not for most of it. That's the part that still gets me, if I'm being honest, which apparently I am. Welcome to my channel. Let's go. Vericept occupied 4 floors of a glass building in Kendall Square, which is Cambridge technically, but everyone calls it Boston because it sounds more important, and Cambridge sounds like you're either a genius or wearing a scarf indoors. The building had that particular biotech aesthetic, reclaimed wood accent walls next to bioreactor equipment, a cold brew tap in the common area, and a CEO who sent all-hands emails that began with family. You know the type. They put a putting green on the 3rd floor in 2019, and then laid off 12 people 3 months later. The putting green stayed. I had a windowless office off the main lab corridor that I had made aggressively livable over a decade. A ficus I named Gerald. A framed periodic table from 1952 that a retiring professor gave me when I finished my master's at BU. A drawer full of protein bar wrappers that I kept meaning to throw away and never did. The lab itself smelled like isopropanol and the specific low-level anxiety of people doing important work on thin budgets, which is a smell I actually love. The way some people love the smell of old books. It smells like consequence. It smells like something actually matters here. I had been at Vericept since their Series B. I watched them go from 30 employees to over 200. I had hired 16 of those people. I had written the SOPs that the FDA had reviewed without a single citation violation for 4 consecutive years, which in regulatory terms is roughly equivalent to winning the Nobel Prize, except nobody takes you to Stockholm and you celebrate with a Diet Coke in a conference room. I love that lab. I want to be clear about that. Because what I did, what I refused to do, was not an act of heroism. It was an act of I cannot do otherwise. Those are different things. Heroes choose. I just couldn't make myself move in the direction they were pointing. Here is what they were pointing at. In the spring of 2022, Vericept was running a phase 2 trial on a compound called VRC114, which was a targeted therapy for a particularly nasty subset of non-small cell lung cancer. The early data was promising. Not spectacular. Promising. There's a difference, and in oncology that difference is a chasm, because spectacular gets you acquired and promising gets you more promising, please, before the runway ends. Our runway was ending. I became aware of the pressure in increments, the way you become aware of a headache. First a vague discomfort, then something you can name, then something you cannot ignore no matter how much water you drink. In April, our CMO, a man named Dr. Richard Pauly, started attending our weekly data reviews. He had never attended weekly data reviews. He was a suit person, not a lab person, and his presence in the lab had always carried the particular discomfort of a golden retriever at a chess tournament. Enthusiastic, disruptive, and convinced that enthusiasm could substitute for understanding, he started asking questions about our outlier exclusion criteria. Now, for the non-scientists in the room, which I'm guessing is some percentage of you, let me explain outlier exclusion as neutrally as possible. In clinical data analysis, you sometimes have data points that fall outside expected ranges. The question of when you can legitimately exclude those data points, and which ones, and how you document that decision, is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of established protocol, regulatory guidance, and the basic premise that if you're going to exclude a number, you have to have decided before you looked at the number that you would exclude it under those conditions. Pre-specification. It's everything. Richard Pauly was not asking about pre-specification. He was asking, in the language of a man who has learned just enough scientific vocabulary to be dangerous, whether there was flexibility in how we handled certain patient response data that was pulling our efficacy endpoint in an unfavorable direction. I told him no. He asked again in May, with slightly different framing, the way people do when they think the first no was a misunderstanding rather than an answer. I told him no again. In June, he sent me a document prepared by our biostatistics contractor, an outside firm, which should have been my first real alarm, that proposed a post hoc analytical approach that would have, in effect, made our Phase 2 efficacy data look meaningfully better than it was. Not fabricated, not entirely, but selectively interpreted in a way that would have influenced how an FDA reviewer read our package, in a way that would have influenced how oncologists read our eventual publication, in a way that, somewhere downstream, in a clinic I would never see, might have influenced what a patient was offered. I sat with that document for a weekend. Gerald the ficus watched me sit with it. I made a lot of coffee. I thought about all the things a reasonable person thinks about in that situation. My mortgage, my daughter's college tuition, the 11 years I'd put into this building, the 16 people I'd hired who depended on an environment that I, to some degree, set the tone for. Then I wrote a 7-page memo documenting why the proposed analytical approach was inconsistent with our pre-registered statistical plan, potentially in violation of 21 CFR Part 11, and absolutely something I would not implement. I sent it to Pauly. I CC'd our Chief Scientific Officer and our VP of Regulatory Affairs. I did not CC HR. I should have CC'd HR. I sent it on a Sunday night, which tells you something about where my head was. I had been composing that memo in my head all weekend. I needed it out of me before Monday. The response came Tuesday. Not to my memo, exactly. Nobody formally responded to my memo, which was its own kind of message. But Tuesday, I was called into a meeting with HR and Pauly, and a woman from legal named Sandra, and I was informed that Vericept had been conducting a performance review process, and that there were concerns that had been documented, and that they wanted to discuss a performance improvement plan. I want to describe the feeling of sitting in that room, but I also want to be accurate about it, because accuracy is kind of my whole thing. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even surprise exactly. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you've been watching a slow-motion car crash for long enough that by the time impact happens, The primary emotion is a grim kind of there it is. I had not sent that memo naively. I knew what a 7-page regulatory objection looks like to a company that is 9 months from running out of cash. I knew what I was risking. I just could not make myself do otherwise. The performance concerns were, and I want you to appreciate the craft here, because whoever drafted this documentation had earned their billable hours. Vague. Communication style concerns. Failure to align with cross-functional team objectives. Resistance to process innovation. I had never, in 11 years, received a formal performance concern. My last 3 reviews had been exceeds expectations. I had a folder. Yes, I have a folder. I have folders for everything. This is perhaps my most relevant character trait and also my greatest gift to posterity. I had a folder with every review, every commendation, every email from Paulie himself saying things like, "Marlo, you're the conscience of this place," which, in retrospect, was not the compliment he intended it to be so much as an accurate description of what he was trying to eliminate. I asked, in that meeting, in a voice I kept very flat and very even, whether these concerns predated my memo of June 12th. Sandra from legal said they would not be discussing specific communications in this context. I said, "Noted," and I wrote it down, and Sandra from legal watched me write it down, and something shifted very slightly in her expression, and I filed that shift away for later. That was June. By August, I was on a formal PIP. By September, the outcome of that PIP was predetermined, and everyone in the room knew it, and nobody said so. By early October, I was informed that Vericept had made the difficult decision to eliminate my position, effective the end of the month, and that they had identified a replacement who would be taking over lab management operations, and that they would need me to transition responsibilities over a 6-week period. 6 weeks. And then they told me her name. Her name was Claire Ashworth. She was 38, which I know because she told me, not because I asked. She had a PhD in molecular biology from Johns Hopkins, and she had, before coming to Vericept, spent 4 years at a biotech in San Diego that I'd heard of. She wore her hair in a low bun that never got messier over the course of a day, no matter what the day contained, which I found slightly unnerving in the way that excessive composure always is. She carried a leather notebook everywhere. Not a laptop, not a tablet. A leather-bound notebook with the elastic band closure and, I noticed on about day 3, a very particular system of color-coded tabs. She asked excellent questions. This was the first thing I noticed, and the thing I kept noticing. In lab management transitions, the new person usually spends the first week or 2 doing one of 2 things. Either performing competence so hard they don't actually absorb anything, or absorbing everything so quietly you forget they're in the room. Claire did neither. She asked questions that were specific, sequential, and always about documentation. Not about the science, which was interesting because she had the credentials to go deep on the science. Not about the personnel, though she was professionally warm with everyone. Documentation, process logs, change control records, deviation reports, the audit trail. On day 4, she asked me where we kept our pre-registered statistical analysis plan for VRC 114. Something moved through me when she asked that. I couldn't have named it then. I told her where to find it. Our regulatory document management system, folder path, access credentials. And I watched her write it down with a very particular focus. The focus of someone writing something down, not because they might forget it, but because they want it in writing. I told myself she was thorough. I told myself this was what good lab managers did. I had been a good lab manager for 31 years. I recognized the habits. What I did not yet recognize was that I was looking at them in someone who was not a lab manager. Here is where I need to give you a piece of information that I did not have at the time, and that changes how everything before it looks in retrospect. You know how in movies, there's always the scene where they replay the footage and you see all the moments you missed? I hate that scene. It always feels cheap. And yet, here we are. Claire Ashworth held a PhD in molecular biology from Johns Hopkins. She also held a JD from Georgetown Law, which she completed part-time over 4 years while working in biotech, which is either the most impressive thing I've ever heard or evidence that she does not require sleep. She had spent 3 years at a firm in D.C. specializing in FDA regulatory enforcement and pharmaceutical litigation before transitioning, or appearing to transition, back into industry. She was not a lab manager. She was an employment and regulatory attorney who had maintained enough active scientific credentials to pass as one in an industry context. She had been hired by Vericept, genuinely hired, through their normal process. Her CV was real. Her references checked out. She had not infiltrated anything. But she had also, in the months before Vericept posted the job opening, been in contact with a former Vericept employee. I will come back to who had described, in some detail, the situation with VRC-114 and with me. And when Vericept posted the lab manager position, Claire had applied for it with a very specific purpose in mind. She was going to get inside. She was going to see what was there, and then she was going to decide what to do with it. She told me this later, over coffee, in a different context, in a different city. She said, "I applied because I needed to see the documents myself. You can't build a regulatory complaint on secondhand description. You need the primary sources." I said, "I was your primary source." She looked at me in a way that was both apologetic and entirely without regret. "You were," she said. "You were the best one I've ever had." The 6 weeks had a texture to them. I want you to understand the texture, because it matters. It was not dramatic. It was not hostile. It was, in fact, one of the more pleasant professional relationships I had experienced in years, which is either darkly funny or just dark, depending on your disposition. We fell into a rhythm. Mornings, I would walk her through whatever operational domain we were covering that day. Equipment maintenance logs, vendor qualification records, personnel training files. Afternoons, she would review documents independently and come back to me with questions. We ate lunch together 3 times a week in the common area. She drank her coffee black, which I respected. She was funny, actually, dry, precise, with a timing that surprised you. She asked about Gerald. She remembered his name after I mentioned it once in passing, which is the kind of social attentiveness that I find simultaneously charming and slightly destabilizing in people. The lab in October has its own particular smell, different from the rest of the year. It's something about the heating system coming back on and interacting with the cleaning protocols, a warmth under the antiseptic, something almost domestic. The windows in the corridor fogged slightly in the mornings when the temperature differential was right. I had walked that corridor for 11 years, and I knew every specific way it changed by season. I was learning, in October, to notice it as a person who was counting her remaining mornings. There's a grief in that. I want to name it. I was grieving, and I was working, and those 2 things were not separate. They were braided, and some mornings I could feel both very clearly, and some mornings I could feel neither. And I moved through the lab like a person who has been slightly anesthetized in a very targeted way. Claire noticed. I know she noticed because on one of those mornings, week 3, a Tuesday, when I had been staring at a deviation log for approximately 4 minutes without actually reading it, she put a coffee on my desk, black, and said, "Do you want to talk about it, or would you prefer I pretend not to notice?" I said, "The second one, please." She said, Done. And walked back out. And we never directly discussed it again. And somehow that was exactly the right thing. Week 3 was also when I made a decision that I have thought about a great deal since. I gave her the folder. Not the whole folder. Not initially. Let me explain what I'm talking about because the folder is going to matter enormously, and I want you to understand what it was before I tell you what I did with it. Over the previous 8 months, from the first time Polly asked about outlier exclusion criteria to the day I was handed my termination notice, I had been saving things, emails, meeting notes, the biostatistics contractor's proposed analytical memo, my own responding memo, follow-up correspondence from Polly that was technically about process alignment, but read, in context, as a sustained attempt to get me to comply with something I had said no to. A chain of emails between Polly and the CSO that someone had accidentally included me on, concerning the Marlowe situation and options for moving forward. Internal Slack messages I'd screenshot on my personal phone because I'd had the specific premonition of someone eventually scrubbing the record. I labeled the folder, as I mentioned, CYA. Cover your assets. This was optimistic of me, in retrospect. What the folder actually contained was evidence. I had been keeping it because I was afraid. I had consulted, briefly and privately, with an employment attorney friend in November of the previous year, who had told me that in Massachusetts, retaliation claims required documentation of the protected activity, documentation of the adverse employment action, and a temporal and contextual connection between the two. She had said, "Keep everything." So I had kept everything. In week 3 of my transition with Claire, she asked me about the June 12th memo. She asked in a very offhand way, while she was reviewing the regulatory affairs folder in our document management system. She said, "I'm not seeing a formal response to a memo from June. Is that filed somewhere else, or was the response verbal?" I said, "The response was a PIP, and then a termination notice." She looked up from her notebook. It was the first time in 3 weeks that she looked at me with something other than professional neutrality. What was in her expression was complicated, careful, like someone who has just heard a door open that they had been standing outside for a while. She said, "Do you still have the memo?" I said, "I have the memo and a significant amount of related material." She said, "Would you be willing to share it?" And here is my fallibility. Here is the thing I need to own, sitting here telling you this story. I said yes. And I do not think I said yes because I had figured out who she was or what she was doing. I said yes because I was angry and I was scared, and I had been carrying that folder for 8 months with nowhere to put it, and she was the first person inside that building who had asked. That is a human reason. It is not a strategic one. I gave that folder to Claire Ashworth in week 3 of my 6-week transition because she asked at the right moment, and I was tired of holding it alone. She took a copy. She was very calm about it. She said, "Thank you. I'll review it carefully." She reviewed it carefully. Week 4. The question I want you to hold, the one I planted in Act 3 and promised would only get answered later, is this. How did Claire know about me before she applied? Who was the former employee who told her what was happening inside Vericept? I didn't know to ask that question in week 4, but I want you to be asking it now. File it away. Week 4 was when the institutional weirdness started, not visible to most people, but I had been in that building for 11 years, and I could feel its specific social weather the way you feel the pressure change before a storm. Polly was in the lab more than usual. There were back-to-back closed-door meetings in the executive suite that lasted into the evenings. At one point, Sandra from legal came down to the lab floor and walked through very deliberately and didn't stop to speak to anyone, which was unusual because Sandra was, despite everything, a person who made small talk. She did not make small talk that afternoon. She was looking at something, or checking on something. I caught her glancing at Claire. Claire, for her part, was perfectly unremarkable. She was doing exactly what a new lab manager in her last 2 weeks of training would do. She was focused, organized, professionally warm. She had begun to build relationships with the bench scientists in a way that was natural and unforced. People liked her. I liked her. And I was in a complicated enough position with regard to her existence that liking her should not have been straightforward. But here's what was also happening, which I couldn't see. Claire had been in contact with an outside partner at her firm throughout her 6 weeks at Vericept. She had been transferring documents, legally, through appropriate channels, protected under attorney work product, in a very careful construction that her firm's ethics committee had reviewed, building a regulatory complaint for the FDA's MedWatch and bioresearch monitoring programs, and separately preparing the foundation of an employment retaliation claim under Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 149 and the Federal False Claims Act. The folder I'd given her was the center of it. The statistical analysis documents she'd pulled from the regulatory system were the frame around it. Her own observations, logged in that color-coded leather notebook, were the corroborating contemporaneous record. She had come in with a hypothesis. She had 6 weeks to build the evidence. She was a week ahead of schedule. End of week 5. 4 days before my last day. I was alone in my office, past 7, doing the kind of final audit that is less about compliance and more about closure, going through files I'd created, decisions I'd documented, making sure the record of my 11 years was clean and complete. Gerald the ficus was overwatered because I'd been stress watering him for a month, and he was listing slightly to the left in a way that I found relatable. Claire knocked on the open door and asked if she could come in. I said yes. She sat in the chair across from my desk, the one I kept for the scientists when they needed to come talk through a protocol problem. And she set her leather notebook on her knee and she looked at me for a moment in a way that felt different from every previous way she had looked at me. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." I said, "All right." She told me, all of it. The JD from Georgetown, the regulatory practice, the former Vericept employee who had reached out to her, the application, the 6 weeks, the folder, what she'd built with it, and where it was going. I listened. I am good at listening when it costs me something to listen. I have trained myself for that, the way you train yourself for other kinds of endurance. Not because it's comfortable, but because the alternative is missing the thing you need to hear. When she finished, the office was quiet. The building had mostly emptied. I could hear the HVAC system and, very faintly, rain on the exterior glass. I said, "Who was the former employee?" She paused in the way of someone who had prepared for this question. She said, "Marcus Lee." I closed my eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Marcus Lee. My lab technician for 6 years. Quiet, brilliant, allergic to confrontation of any kind, who had left Vericept in March of that year for what he'd told me was a better opportunity in New York. Who had hugged me on his last day and said that he hoped things got better. Who had, I now understood, already started making calls. He had seen what was happening. He hadn't known how to say anything to me directly. I understood that. Marcus would find it almost physically impossible to confront an authority figure he cared about. So he had done the thing he could do, which was find someone with the tools to handle it and point them at the building. He had done it for me. I sat with that for a moment. Gerald listed to the left. The rain got slightly louder. I said, "What happens now?" She said the complaint to the FDA was ready to file. The retaliation claim was structurally complete. She was recommending I retain independent counsel to pursue it, which she could not do herself given the conflict, but she had colleagues she trusted. She said the regulatory complaint had the potential to trigger a formal investigation of the VRC 114 trial data. She said my documentation was, she chose the word carefully, exceptional. I said, I've been called worse. She almost smiled. Not quite. She was still carrying the weight of what she'd done, and how she'd done it, and the fact that she owed me something for it. She said, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. I needed the documents. I said, you needed me not to know what I was doing. She said, yes. I thought about that. I thought about the 7-page memo, the folder labeled CYA, the 31 years. The fact that I had given her everything she needed because she had asked me at the right moment, and I had been too tired to keep holding it. I said, if you'd told me on day 1, I'd have given you the folder anyway. She looked at me. I said, I'm not sure if that makes you feel better or worse, she said quietly. Both. My last day was a Friday in mid-November. Boston had gone gray in that particular way it does. Not dramatically gray, just the slow resignation of a city that knows what's coming and has chosen to be stoic about it. I walked the lab corridor one more time. The isopropanol smell. The hum of the centrifuge in room 4 that had always run slightly louder than spec and that I had logged for replacement every 6 months for 4 years, and that Vericept had never replaced. And this seemed, in the moment, like a metaphor for something, although I was too tired to fully construct it. I left Gerald. The ficus. I left him on purpose. I know that's the kind of detail people either find charming or unhinged, and I genuinely do not know which camp I'm in. But he'd been in that office for 8 years, and he was overwatered and unhappy, and I thought, if whoever is in here next has any decency, they'll figure it out. And if they don't, well, some things don't survive the transition. That's just what happens. I said goodbye to the scientists. There were hugs. There were cards. There was a sheet cake from the common area kitchen that said, "We'll miss you, Marlowe," in blue frosting, and I ate a piece of it standing up because I couldn't trust myself to sit down and eat it slowly. Janet from Quality Assurance told me she would work for me anywhere. Brendan from the synthesis team, who was 26 and brilliant, and had been my biggest source of both pride and gray hairs for 2 years, shook my hand, and then looked like he was going to say something and then didn't. And that undone sentence was, somehow, the hardest part of the day. Claire and I said goodbye in the corridor, professionally, in front of people. She shook my hand. She held it a beat longer than a handshake requires. She said, "Thank you for the training." I said, "Make good use of it." We both knew what we were talking about. Neither of us said it aloud. That's another thing that 31 years teaches you. Some agreements don't need to be spoken. The FDA complaint was filed 6 weeks after my last day. In January, Vericept received a notice of regulatory inquiry regarding the VRC 114 trial. In February, they received a document subpoena. In March, Richard Pauly retained personal counsel. In April, the company announced a voluntary suspension of the VRC 114 trial, pending data integrity review, which is a sentence that sounds administrative and is actually a kind of quiet earthquake. My retaliation claim, filed in December, was handled by an employment attorney named Diane Park, who I want to take a moment to appreciate because she is extraordinary. And also, she is the reason that Vericept's settlement offer, when it finally came, was not the first number they put on the table, or the second, or the third. The number we settled on is not something I can disclose, and I will honor that. But I will tell you it was enough to matter. It was enough to mean something about what my 7-page memo was worth, not a fortune. Not the kind of number that makes you feel vindicated in the Hollywood sense. The kind of number that means you didn't lose, which is sometimes the best available version of winning. Marcus called me in February when news of the FDA inquiry became public. He said, "I should have said something to you directly." I said, "You said something." He said, "It wasn't to your face." I said, "Marcus, you saw a problem and you found someone who could fix it, and you did it because you cared about doing the right thing, and that is—" I stopped. I started again. That is what good scientists do, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. There was a silence. Then he said, "I learned that from watching you," which is the sort of thing that ends a phone call, because there is nothing left to say after it. We hung up. I sat in my kitchen in the house that is, now, somewhat more financially stable than it was. Gerald the ficus was there, because whoever took over my office had, in fact, had no decency, and Claire had quietly made sure he was returned to me. I'm not going to explain how. It's a small thing. It was not a small thing. I want to tell you what I think about now, a year out, about Vericept, about Claire, about all of it. I think about the scientists who are still in that building, running experiments, doing their work with whatever uncertainty the VRC-114 situation has seeded into the culture. I hope it's the productive kind of uncertainty, the kind that makes you more careful, more scrupulous, more willing to ask hard questions and accept hard answers. I hope Brendan is okay. I think about him a lot, actually. He's too talented to become cynical before 40. I think about Polly occasionally, and I try to think about him honestly, which means not reducing him to a villain. He was a man with a runway problem, and investors breathing down his neck, and a bone-deep misunderstanding of where the line was. That does not excuse anything. It explains some things. An explanation is not absolution, but it's also not nothing. He made choices. They were wrong. He is now personally named in an ongoing regulatory proceeding, which is its own kind of consequence, and I am not going to perform either satisfaction or sympathy about that. I just note it. I try to note things accurately. Claire left her firm in the spring and, last I heard, has gone back to a teaching position at Georgetown, where she runs a seminar on biotech regulatory ethics. I like to think about her students. I like to think about what it means to learn from someone who has been inside the thing she's teaching. We had dinner once, the previous spring in D.C., on my way through for a conference. She ordered wine. I had coffee. We talked for 3 hours. At some point she said, "Do you regret any of it?" I thought about the question seriously. 31 years of doing something well. 11 years in a building I loved. The month on the PIP, which is a specific kind of professional humiliation that I would not wish on people I actively dislike. The 6 weeks of training the person who was dismantling the institution that was dismantling me, without knowing that was what I was doing. I said, I regret that the trial data affected patients who deserved accurate information. I regret that Marcus felt he couldn't come to me directly. I regret Gerald's brief period of neglect. She waited. I said, I don't regret the memo. I don't regret the folder. I don't regret a single question you asked me that I answered honestly. She said, even knowing? I said, especially knowing. Here's the thing I've been sitting with. The thing I didn't know how to say until just now. I spent 31 years believing that doing the work right, doing it accurately, documenting it honestly, holding the line when the line needed holding, was its own complete justification. That integrity was sufficient. That the record would speak for itself if someone asked it the right questions. What I didn't know was that someone still has to ask, and they have to have the tools to listen. And sometimes, in the specific architecture of the world as it actually is, the person asking is someone you've spent 6 weeks treating like the replacement you never wanted, when she was actually the one thing the building didn't know it had. They wanted me to train her well. I trained her well. I'm still not sure they understand what that means. The VRC 114 trial data review is ongoing. The lab still runs. Somewhere in Cambridge right now, there are scientists doing real work under artificial light, and some of them are getting it right, and some of them are being pressured to get it wrong, and the difference between those two outcomes turns, more often than anyone comfortable will admit, on a single person who decides to write it down and refuse to walk it back. I was that person once. I would be that person again, given the same information and the same choice, in the same building, with the same terrible putting green and the same cold brew tap and the same CEO who called us all family. I would be that person 100 times. The cost was real, and the cost was worth it, and I am not going to perform uncertainty about that for the comfort of anyone who finds certainty inconvenient. The record exists. Someone asked the right questions. And if you're in that building right now, if you're the person holding something you're afraid to write down, I need you to know that the folder is the thing. The folder is always the thing. Label it whatever you want. Just keep it.